And up next is our keynote presentation, and we're very pleased to welcome back Dr. Maria Carrera, Emerita Professor of Spanish, California State University, Long Beach. She is also the co-director and Emerita co-director of the National Heritage Language Resource Center at UCLA. Her research focuses on heritage languages with a concentration in Spanish in the United States, as well as the less commonly taught languages. Her recent work focuses on identity, resilience, and heritage language development and maintenance. As a heritage speaker of Spanish herself, she knows firsthand the rewards and challenges that come from maintaining the home language. That knowledge, along with her research, inspired her to launch Heritage Language Exchange in 2020. HLX, as it's also known, aims to be a hub of resources for heritage language teachers and programs from all languages and levels of education. So the Heritage Language Exchange just held its first fair last weekend, and congratulations on that. And thank you so much again for agreeing to join us and share your work with us.
Thank you so much, Russell, for this very kind introduction. I am, of course, delighted to be back in one of my favorite places. I love Seattle so much that after presenting a few years back, I brought my husband back because I said, you love this city, it's wonderful. And so I'm delighted to be back, even if only virtually. And of course, I have to start with a big thank you to the organizers of this symposium who have worked very hard. Michelle in particular, who invited me to present and who also works incredibly hard, and all of you for being here. And welcome, Angelica. You have big shoes to fill. Maria Gilman did a fantastic job, but I know you're up to it. So in this presentation, I want to take stock of the state of heritage language education, and then think about what that means in terms of building a stronger future. With that in mind, I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about the US linguistic landscape, and then move to analyzing what's happening in schools from a framework that's called institutionalization. And I'll explain that later. And then I want to close with some very exciting things that have happened very recently. Some of them have only come into being during the pandemic, but I think they're excellent in terms of the future of HL education. So I want to go back to 2017, when this very influential document, America's Languages, Investing in Language Education for the 21st Century, was published. It was very influential because it was commissioned by a bipartisan group of Congress and authored by a commission of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, an extremely prestigious institution, of course, as you know. And what the document did was to advocate very strongly for expanding, improving access to language learning to as many people as possible. It argued that more than ever, we need to create a large group of Americans who can speak 2 or more languages at high levels of proficiency, that this is dire for the country. In addition, it outlined 5 areas that were high priority, 5 areas for developing the field of heritage language education, not heritage language education in general. And heritage languages was singled out among these 5 areas. So as you can imagine, this was all met with great fanfare. Everybody was very happy. Language educators and heritage language specialists in particular were clapping, rightly so, right? However, for those of us who've been around for a long time, for the dinosaurs, and I count myself in that group, it felt a little bit like Back to the Future. Because I say this because starting in 1998, there were a number of very high profile, highly influential publications that basically said the same thing. So 20 years already before the America's Languages was published, we had highly influential publications saying the same thing. I'm going to show you very briefly what I mean by this, just focusing on the first one, which was by Dick Breck and Catherine Ingold, but all the other ones follow a similar format. So the paper in 1998 by Brecht and Engel made a two-part argument, divided here in red and green. The first part in red said that there was an unprecedented need in the country for individuals with high levels of proficiency in 2 or more languages, and that this was higher, the need for these kinds of individuals was higher than ever, unprecedented, right? The second part of the argument was that heritage language speakers were a great resource for filling this need. Keep in mind, this is 1998. Let's fast forward now, almost 20 years, and notice that it's the same argument being made. They say that the need has been higher than any other time in history, and that heritage language learners are a resource because they have a head start already with respect to linguistic knowledge and competencies. So the two reports really were quite similar. And for the dinosaurs, it raised the question, well, 20 years later, why are we still trying to make the case for heritage language education using very similar arguments, number one? And then why is everybody cheering when it is made? Granted, the America's languages argument was wonderful, but why are we clapping for it as if we had never heard this message before? After all, the last 20 years have seen vigorous innovation in the field of heritage language research, pedagogy, and field presence. In the area of research, very briefly, we have seen the establishment of 2 new fields of research: heritage language linguistics, which focuses on heritage language grammars, and instructed heritage language acquisition, which looks at interventions and how they work or don't work with heritage language learners. We've seen research on HL learners' functional skills, their literacy skills, differences between HL learners and L2 learners. And here I want to give a shout out to Professor Fernandez-Dobao's research, which is so important in this regard and in improving what happens in mixed classes. And we've also seen a lot of research on HL learners' aspirational and relational needs. And here I want to highlight very recently work by Claudia Holguin and others on CRT. Putting all of this together, we now have what can be rightly called a signature HL pedagogy, which says to teach grammar, you want to take a targeted approach rather than a comprehensive approach. We also have techniques, strategies for developing HL learners' functional skills, right? Olga Kagan's From Two Principles, a top-down approach where you start making language in the classroom that's for real-world context, teaching for multi-literacies. And in the area of socio-affective issues, we've made great progress. And finally, differentiated teaching, which is so important with HL learners as well as in mixed classes. And I know we're going to have a wonderful presentation later on this topic by 2 leaders in this field. In terms of field presence, well, we have journals. We have the Heritage Language Resource Center, which was so important, and it was established in 2006. Many conferences and workshops since then, mission statements by leading professional organizations, a very robust social media presence. We owe a lot there to Alejandro Lee, who's here with us, and I'm going to mention him later more specifically. Certificates in HL teaching, which have recently become available, but I have put the $ there because they are expensive, and I'll come back to that later. And then certification for students, which we'll hear about in this conference and from others in particular, but I will mention as being very important in this presentation as well. So given all these incredible advancements, why are we still trying to make the case for HL education? Why haven't we moved on to something else? It seems like we're stuck with the way things were 20 years ago. And what does this say about how institutionalized or established our field, HL languages, are? Before I delve into this, I just want to give you a very quick overview of the US linguistic landscape. 22% of this country speaks a language other than English at home. If you look at the line directly below the gray line, you can see that Washington State is just a little bit underneath that, 1 out of 5 people in Washington state speak a language other than English at home. Go all the way up to the top and you'll see California, but it's like in California where I live, almost 45%, if we round up, of the state speaks a language other than English at home. These are astounding numbers, right? And so are these. The US is home to over 350 lotes, languages other than English, spoken by some 67 million speakers. We are also home to 7 languages with more than 1 million speakers. Here's something I bet many of you didn't know. I didn't know myself. Tagalog is our 3rd most spoken lote, and Vietnamese is our 4th most spoken lote. Amazing. Let's now talk about children as we move into the educational realm. More than 1 out of 5, getting close now to 1 out of 4, children speak a language other than English at home, and these children are called heritage language speakers. In the educational context, when they are studying their HL, their heritage language, they're called heritage language learners. Now, here's what's interesting. We know how many heritage language speakers attend our public schools because we keep track of this information. However, we do not know how many of those heritage language speakers, children who come into school with another language, are actually engaged in studying that language. This lack of knowledge is not from a lack of tracking mechanisms in the field. Indeed, we have many such tracking mechanisms that periodically survey the state of language instruction. At the K-12 level, we have most recently the National K-12 Foreign Language Enrollments Report. In higher ed, we have the periodic reports that the MLA puts out. And of course, we have information from state departments of education, school districts, and other sources. You can see here, for example, how enrollments are tracked in high school and post-secondary education. There are many other languages too. I just didn't have room to put it here. But here's what's not tracked. Which of these enrollments, which ones are heritage language learners? And what courses are available? These sources, these surveys track the type of courses that are being taught, whether they're lower division or higher division, more advanced. But notice they're not tracking the availability of courses. We can also learn by looking at these surveys. We can ask, are we doing this? How are we doing in terms of offering languages to as wide a sector of society as possible? Right? Well, remember that there are 350 lotes spoken in the United States. 7 of them have more than 1 million speakers. If we look at, I think these were the 15 most commonly taught languages in the United States, it looks pretty good. It looks like 5 of those 7 that have more than 1 million speakers are actually being taught. Although I should say French is probably taught more as a second language, right, than the actual French speakers, which tend to be Haitian and African students who bring a different variety of French. But be that as it may, we see that there are 5 of those 7. But what is missing from this, list are many other heritage languages, and most notably Tagalog or Filipino, which, as I mentioned earlier, is the 3rd most spoken lote in the United States, as well as Vietnamese, which is the 4th most spoken lote in the United States. Already back in 2014, Fee, Rhodes, and Wiley had noted that there was this discrepancy between what we were teaching in schools and the reality, the real world out there of the US linguistic landscape. And then in 2017, Olga Kagan, who founded the National Heritage Language Resource Center, made a similar observation. She said, most schools do not teach the languages of the local communities. And if they do, they don't differentiate between the curriculum for foreign language and heritage language learners. And if I had time, I would show you this because it's fabulous to see it. When you go to district web pages, they're all lumped together. Right. So putting this all together, here's the situation. We don't know how many heritage language learners there are in our schools. We do know numbers of speakers, but we don't know our learners. We don't know not much about the availability of HL courses, how many are being, how many courses are being taught, how widely available, what levels. And we see that relatively few languages are being taught and that there's little correspondence to the US linguistic landscape. Now, so far I've asked a lot of how many questions, right? But clearly it's not just about numbers. More importantly, perhaps, it's about mindsets and dispositions in the educational system, because these mindsets influence curriculum, classroom practices, program level practices, and shine a light on blind spots in education. And here's a little snippet of what we can see when we scrutinize some web pages. This comes from the California Department of Education, where over 2 million students speak a language other than English at home. They're heritage speakers. So notice they know the number of heritage speakers. These children constitute 40% of the state's public school enrollment. Interestingly, when you go through the web page, they are referred to as English learners and fluent. They're classified into two groups, those who are English learners and those who are fluent English proficient. You do not see them being referenced in terms of their heritage language. You can see this here. This is a list of the 74 languages in California's public schools where 15% or more of the population speak this language. That's remarkable. 74 languages, right? But notice how they're referenced. They're referenced in terms, again, of this category. Are they learning English or are they already proficient in English? In this wonderful document, we see nothing about how proficient are they in the heritage language. This is remarkable because remember, America's Languages told us in 2017 that we need to build proficiency in heritage languages to attend to the needs of this country. If we're not even examining where our students are, we're not reaching that goal, right? So now that I have given you an overview, I'm ready to move into institutionalization. Institutionalization is basically a process through which an organization assimilates an innovation into a structure. And the innovation I'm going to talk about is HL education. We can look at institutionalization at many different levels, in particular schools, in particular districts, the field at large, etc. And I'm going to be doing that a little bit today, but I don't have time to run the gamut of context of institutionalization. There are 4 indicators that have been proposed, 4 indicators of institutionalization. Number one is acceptance by relevant participants who see the innovation as being valuable and legitimately belonging in institution. Widespread use of the innovation throughout the institution, organization, district, etc. The firm expectation that the innovation will continue. And related to this, that the 4th one is that the innovation is stable and routinized, but here it means that it doesn't depend on the existence of individuals, right? That it will continue even when those individuals are not there to keep it going. So now let's recall what we have learned so far from the overview I gave you previously. What can we say in terms of these 4 indicators of institutionalization? Well, it doesn't look like there's much acceptance because it doesn't look like it's being seen. If it's not being tracked, it's because it's not HL education, it's not being seen. And then remember, we said there aren't that many languages being taught, and even some of our most widely spoken lotes are not being taught. So that throws into question the whole issue of how widespread it is. Now, in 2017, I started to look at this issue of institutionalization a little bit more closely. And I wanted to do more than just the numbers, right? So I gave a survey through the NHLRC to post-secondary language programs. They're the easiest to reach. I have to say, below that, it becomes difficult to reach participants, teachers. The survey was answered by 296 programs that teach HL learners in 34 states, all sorts of institutions, 27 languages. And here's some key findings. I apologize, I'm going to go through them very, very quickly. Finding number one is that close to half of the programs that answered my survey actually have separate instruction classes for HL learners. Sarah Baudry earlier found very similar numbers for Spanish. Now, keep in mind, there's a self-selection bias here. So for sure, there's an overrepresentation here. But nevertheless, close to half is pretty good. Second finding is that programs that offer HL courses, remember that's 47% of those that answered the survey. Now, most of those programs offer 1 or 2 HL courses at the most. Why is that important? Okay, so they offer 1 or 2 courses, pardon me, and then after that, HL learners are supposed to integrate into the regular L2 track. Why is that important? Well, remember, America's language told us that HL learners, the advantage they have is that they have a head start in language learning. But notice what these programs are doing. They put them for the first 2 courses in the HL classes, specialized, and then they just throw them back in, sort of canceling or not seeing the advantages that these students bring to the classroom, right? And so instead of continuing to build on what they're doing in their HL classroom, they just subsume them under the regular program. A third finding is that HL learners are frequently taught in out-of-classroom formats. So remember, 53% of the programs that answer the survey do not offer separate instruction for heritage language learners. But what's interesting is that roughly half of those programs that don't have separate classes actually have some kind of specialized instruction in what I'm going to call alternative out-of-classroom formats, such as independent studies, tutoring, internships, etc. So when you factor this in to, when you add it up to the programs that actually offer separate instruction, it looks like about 73% of programs that answer the survey are doing something special for HL learners. They're not throwing them into the regular L2 tracks. That's very good. It looks like it's very good from the point of view of the second indicator of institutionalization. It's particularly good because it looks like a good approach to solving the problem of low enrollments. Low enrollments are frequently cited as a major roadblock to having an HL program. These out-of-classroom formats are good because they're not subject to minimal enrollments, right? If you're teaching an independent study, you can do it with 1 or 2 students. And because they offer personalized, individualized instruction, which is exactly what you want with heritage language learners who differ from each other so much. However, now, did you sense a however was coming? There is a however here. These out-of-classroom practices are not into the regular curriculum, are not built into the regular curriculum of programs. And so there is no firm expectation that they will continue, right? Because they're not part of the regular major or curriculum. They are offered when somebody can offer them, right? And that's a problem for institutionalization. Finding number 4 is that faculty are the secret sauce of programs. This is what I mean. Typically, we hear a lot about enrollments. We don't have enough HL learners to offer something special for them. But what I learned through this study is that faculty with initiative, expertise, authority, and special access to institutional resources are essential for an HL program. to thrive. These faculty, and I'll show you an example, can often get around the problem of roll enrollments and have thriving programs when they're low, they're few HL learners, as well as they can block in the negative, not faculty that are not good can block advances in departments that have high enrollments. So faculties can act as gatekeepers and say no more heritage language courses, either against them. Let's talk about the good. An Arabic professor, and this Arabic professor answered my survey, and he outlined four wonderful strategies. First, he says he built the program methodically and realistically, not over anticipating enrollments. Second, he spreads out expenditure, so he's clever financially by offering certain courses through the evening program, which is another budget. Third, he opens sections through the honors program, which attracts highly motivated and highly achieving students. And then the fourth strategy he outlines, he offers independent studies, what we saw earlier. Clearly, we all want to have a professor like this, a colleague like this. I'm going to assume that many of you are like this, and this is wonderful. However, did you sense there was a however coming there? Notice this violates principle 4 of institutionalization. The continuation, when the continuation depends on an individual who does an awful lot of work on a volunteer basis, well, we have to be very thankful for that individual, but it's a sign that the innovation is not stable and routinized. Right? So it's a problem from the point of view of institutionalization. Fifth finding, HL courses are typically taught by part-time, non-tenure track instructions. This isn't a problem. Actually, it's good that we have our non-tenure track instructors teaching our lectures, because in my experience, these are the best darn instructors that I've seen. The problem is it has to do with continuity. Right? That part-time instructors, unfortunately, this is very tragic, are not always hired from one semester to the other. So if they are the ones doing the heavy lifting for teaching, and if they're not sometimes hired from one semester to the next, it means that the availability of HL instruction fluctuates from one semester or one term to the other. And this creates problems of articulation across the curriculum. So once again, we see that there's a problem with the firm expectation of continuation, and we see that there's a problem with the innovation being stabilized and routinized. The sixth finding pertains to roadblocks to institutionalization, to having HL courses and opportunities for HL learners. We already talked a little bit about the persistent problem of low enrollments. I'm going to come back to it later. For now, I want to look at these three: teacher qualification, pedagogical materials, and teaching is not on the path to tenure, because they are related. Scott McGinnis said something very important in this 2014 paper. He said, the question is not whether there are current or potential students, but the more critical cross-cutting need is for teachers, certified or not, by alternative or traditional means, who are sufficiently qualified and committed to teaching and learning of their language and cultural heritage. We need teachers out there. We know there's a shortage of language teachers, and there's an even greater shortage of qualified HL language teachers. Now, this sets up kind of a catch-22 situation. Without qualified teachers, we don't have people to create pedagogical materials that are well suited to HL teaching. Without a higher ed, HL teaching being on the path to tenure, then we don't have people that want to invest in becoming qualified. And then teaching suffers with negative repercussions with enrollment. Students who are not being taught in an engaging way do not want to sign up for courses that are not engaging and that don't address their needs. I have already talked a little bit about colleagues and administrators for positive and for the negative. I will come back to that shortly. But let me now summarize the picture of institutionalization. Well, in terms of levels of acceptance, there seems to be a mixed picture. We are offering a lot of things, but there's not widespread use of innovations. There are colleagues that are against HL teaching. And in terms of 3 and 4, indicators 3 and 4, we have a very weak picture of institutionalization. And we also see significant interconnected roadblocks to institutionalization. The fact that they're interconnected makes it difficult because it creates a chicken or the egg problem, right? How do you raise enrollments without training teachers and creating materials? But how do you do that without enough enrollments? Because enrollments are seen as a source of revenue. So this brings us back to this question I posed at the very beginning. Why was this document cheered as if we had never heard this before? Well, we now have the answer, because HL education is not institutionalized in any significant way. We have a long ways to go before we can claim that it's as much a fiber of language education as our second languages. Now, that was a picture 5 years ago, and frankly, it was a sad picture. So I am happy to move to a much better picture today. Things that I'm going to call exciting educations, fueled by educational entrepreneurs. And we have some of them here, quite a few of them here. And these innovations are creating new lanes, new pathways in HL education. They are disrupting education in the best way possible. And another important thing is that many of them are bottom up, which means it includes all of us, right? So recall the Arabic professor with his brilliant 4 strategies. As I said, we all want to have a colleague like this. This is an exemplary colleague, but he's not an example of educational entrepreneurship. Why not? Because recall that he's an example of person dependence. And he reminds us that in his program, there's a lack of routine allocation of resources, that we need this person to be struggling against issues related to allocation of resources. This person is also, because the person like this, and many of us are like this, are within a department, we are frequently working in isolation with lack of dissemination of the work that we do. And look at what Nori said in 2015 about this situation. He said, it becomes difficult to innovate and institutionalize when efforts to redesign or improve courses rest on a few faculty, think about the Arabic professor, or teaching support staff, think about our lecturers, whose work remains isolated, right? They're doing great work, but they are isolated. And not only that, but notice what this paper points out. Their impact on the wider culture of teaching and learning is often highly limited due to being subsumed by larger forces within institutions, such as department culture, inertia and resistance to change, funding issues, and lack of management support. Remember the roadblock that colleagues and administration can pose for even the hardest working of people. These roadblocks work because these hardworking, creative, and knowledgeable individuals are subsumed by departmental and institutional cultures. So what we need to overcome these roadblocks are what are called networks, inter-organizational networks that serve as conduits for the diffusion of practices and ideas. These networks are really important because they create an enabling culture that bypasses the problems or associated with departmental cultures, right? And they enable doers, thinkers, creative people to come out with solutions and to build new lanes in the highway of HL education. I'm going to give you 5 examples of networks that are doing exactly that. They are expanding access to instruction, like the 2017 document by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences tells us. They're expanding access to information and resources for teachers. They are addressing roadblocks to institutionalization, for example, qualification of teachers, and they're overall opening the field up to new directions of growth. The first of these is the Coalition of Community-Based Schools, and we have Joy Payton here with us today. And I'm so excited to tell you a little bit about her amazing work. I think you probably all know a lot about it. The coalition was founded in 2013 by a core group of community school teachers and administrators under the leadership of Joy. And what they try to do was address this need in HL education to focus on the needs of community-based schools. A lot of the effort at the time, I was at the NHLRC, was going into higher ed, and it still is. And these teachers, and Joy felt that it was time to pay attention to do something about community language schools. The goals were to make community-based schools visible to the nation, in the nation language learning landscape, and to connect teachers of community-based schools to facilitate sharing of information and resources. Today, the community-based schools have 97, the coalition has 97 language representatives who work with 35 languages, and they have partnered with some of the most important leading organizations of our field. Talk about interorganizational partnerships, right? And their activities listed here, you can see, involve dissemination of information, the creation of networks of teachers that come together, for instance, for conferences, webinars on issues of practice, materials, etc. This is the very definition of an enabling culture. The second example I want to give you is that of Saba Online Schools. This was also a partnership with the Coalition of Community-Based Schools. The Saba Online School came online, came into existence during the pandemic, which is a remarkable thing. It's a fully online Serbian heritage language schools. And they enact best practices in online HL teaching and age appropriate curriculum. And they meet 4 times a week, which is a remarkable thing. Keep in mind that many heritage language schools, because of various limitations, are only able to meet 1 day a week. So this is a wonderful advancement. Saba made a presentation, which was hosted by the Coalition of Community Language Schools, where they shared with people everywhere their secret sauce, all but not secret anymore, right? Everything that they're doing to make this effort succeed. And in so doing, they created a model for increasing the variety of HL languages taught. Remember, we're not teaching anywhere near that 350 number of HL languages taught in the US. And we're not even coming close to teaching those that are most spoken in the United States. And so they're providing a new pathway for aligning instruction with local communities of speakers. And they're not just doing it for themselves, but they're out there teaching this model so that other communities can do it. The third initiative I want to show you or talk to you about very briefly is a competency-based certification. This is very new, but in my opinion is, dare I say it, the most promising way forward from the student point of view in HL education. This afternoon, you're going to hear a lot more about this, in particular, the bilingual seal of biliteracy, seal of well, forget it, I'm too stressed out to remember the name right now. But I also want to point out this that has happened in Washington State. Michelle has had a lot to do with it. It's another kind of seal, Global Competence Certificate for Heritage Language Speakers. And this is another one of those very significant developments that is likely to attract students, a very powerful way to deal with the problem of low enrollments and to fulfill what the 2017 document is asking us to do in terms of preparing a workforce with higher language skills. I've shown you 3 of these innovations, and they fall within the domain of what are called projects. When you're innovating, you can have projects that require a lot of work, a lot of thinking ahead, a lot of people involved, and a substantial amount of investment of time and resources. But it turns out that there's another track to innovation, and they're called easy wins. I'm going to read what is there. It's so obvious, but it had not occurred to me, and I started reading this kind of literature. And it says, easy wins are the ideas that show an obvious, demonstrable benefit right away and are so straightforward to implement that they don't require large budget approval or team cooperation to make it happen. Just take action and start implementing them right away. So example number 4 is a good example of an easy win, easy and fast to implement. And I'm sure you've all seen this proliferation of virtual PD opportunities during the pandemic. I'm going to give you an example of those available in HL Teaching and Learning that are of interest to me, that are free and available between February 5th and March 8th, the span of 1 month. Well, we started with the fair that the HLX, the Heritage Language Exchange, and I'll talk about it in 1 second, hosted last week, and where Michelle was our keynote speaker. And then I'm going to move fast through these. Some of you will be attending some of these things. So 12 events that I like, but there are other ones for HL learners in 4 weeks, all free and accessible to everyone and relatively easy to put together. These are easy wins, right? Let me give you now the 5th example of an innovation. And this is the 2nd example of an easy win. And that's the question of the week. And this is a project of the Heritage Language Exchange, which is a site that I co-created with Alejandra Lee, who's here, and Sybil Alexandrov. And it's a site for and by teachers. Very recently, we launched this question of the week, which is a crowdsourcing approach to gathering information. Remember, we don't know a lot. I started out this presentation by saying we don't know a lot about what's happening in HL teaching. So this is a crowdsourcing approach to getting to know more. And it's a 1-minute survey posted every 2 weeks and widely distributed through social media. Then the survey probes teachers on mindsets, practices, needs, etc. The results are distributed to be applied, hopefully, to the creation of initiatives, projects, and other easy wins. Let me show you how this is working out. As I said, we only launched it 3 weeks ago. So for the first week, we only had 41 respondents. And the question was, do you have professional opportunities available through your school, and how valuable are they? Green is very valuable. Blue is somewhat valuable. Yellow, not so valuable. It's good that very few identify those as not being valuable. But notice that orange is my school does not have professional opportunities available. And 1/3 of respondents said they did not have these. In Spanish in particular, the number was 45%. 45% of people in Spanish said they do not have these professional development opportunities available through your school. Moving forward to question number 2, we followed up a little bit more on professional development opportunities. And we asked them, well, how useful are the following professional development opportunities? Yellow is very useful. And we can see that at the top, or the most useful, were periodic workshops offered by schools, right? The second most useful opportunities for learning for developing professional strategies for teaching HL learners was collaborations with other teachers. Interesting. In third and fourth place, I think they're about the same: attendance at professional conferences, and then self-directed reading and videos. Now, it's very interesting here. You see that some are in red and some are in blue. The red ones are 100% free. They're easy wins. The blue ones are expensive. And from talking to teachers recently, focusing on resource allocation, I have learned that many programs do not have money to send teachers to professional conferences or even to pay for somebody to come in to give periodic workshops. And yet, look, we learned from this question of the week how useful these two 100% free approaches are. So how can you use this information? We want to disseminate this information. Well, organize opportunities for collaborations across HL teachers in your district. We saw that collaborations are useful. Curate a repository of useful readings and videos. Distribute information on virtual talks, conferences, and other PD opportunities. This is something that Alejandro Lee has been doing for years, and it is so useful. And to fill in this gap of information, create a database of information on HL programs in your district and share this information so we can learn what is happening. And now I'm going to move to summarize and look ahead. But before I do, I want to plead with you to please answer the question of the week. You can get the URL at the HLX change, but notice it's HLXchange.com, or I have put a direct link to it that you should be able to get in the document that's being put together with links. You can see that it's a very useful approach to growing the field of HL education. So to summarize and look ahead, we can see that the teaching of heritage language is far from being institutionalized in US schools and universities. And frankly, some of the roadblocks it's difficult to think of how to deal with them, right? The good news is that there's a promising new direction, one of educational entrepreneurship networks, which allow the dissemination of information and enabling culture for dealing for roadblocks, and that offer two routes: easy wins and projects. And altogether, these innovations are revolutionizing HL education. They're opening up new professional development opportunities and networks of support, expanding access to HL education to languages that have not been taught, growing enrollments and relevancy for students through certification, disseminating information and ideas, and crowdsourcing information gathering. They are, in short, examples of disruptive innovation. They are creating a new market and value network, and they're transforming the field, creating new tasks previously seemingly inconceivable, right? These innovations create networks that transcend departmental cultures and they address roadblocks. They open new lanes in HL, new markets in the language of business, and they offer opportunities for continuous improvement of the field that are accessible, meaningful, inclusive, very wide-reaching, and affordable. Actually, they're free. And perhaps most important to me is that they engage with frontline educators, because HLX was created by the three of us because we believe that frontline educators are those who best understand the systemic problems and who are in the best position to address these problems and grow the field. And so with that, I'll leave you with this question: what will your innovation be?